Hi, welcome to lesson 8.5. This is objective F and it is culture after 1945. This is some of my favorite information all about the 1950s, culture and conformity and challenges to that conformity. So let's talk. Explain how mass culture has been maintained or challenged over time. So you have to think about what is mass culture and then how has it been maintained? That's a continuity. And how has it been challenged by the young people? This has only one part, this video: conformity and change. We've got a picture behind me, if I can move myself, of I Love Lucy and the man in the gray flannel suit. There's going to be some photos added to this PowerPoint just so you can get some visual. You are to explain how mass culture became increasingly homogeneous in the post-war years, inspiring challenges to conformity by artists, intellectuals, and my favorite, rebellious youth. So let's talk about this post-war culture of conformity. Number one, cultural homogeneity. Homogeneous means sameness. So we're talking about how people were wanting to cultivate a culture of sameness. But let's talk about that. Homogeneity was not the status quo for people of color and working class people. When we're talking about this mass culture, we're talking predominantly about white middle class Americans. And keep in mind that the middle class was rapidly growing during this time. Suburbs were rapidly growing during this time. So let's fast forward. The Black Americans being excluded from this culture of sameness, in part, is what leads to the civil rights movement. So that's a fast forward. The civil rights movement does begin in the post-war years, but it picks up steam in the late 1950s and especially into the 1960s. So let's talk about this. What are the factors that prompted this culture of sameness, this culture of conformity? Well, number one, the new invention was television. If you could afford it, you wanted to have a TV. Your neighbors were getting TVs. You had to have a TV. Keep in mind, there were only three networks. Three. There was no cable. Three networks. So guess what? Everybody was watching the same programming. And commercials. There was no remotes. You had to get up and turn a knob, a dial. Nobody wants to get up. So you watched commercials as well. So the programs themselves and the commercials lead to this culture of conformity. So programming and advertising. Shows such as I Love Lucy, shows such as Leave It to Beaver began to picture and romanticize the ideal family. And again, by ideal family, we mean nuclear family: dad who works, mom who stays home, two kids, happy kids, non-sassy kids, and they all live in the same house and they eat dinner together, and it makes it seem like everybody is living their lives this way. So TV also introduces a whole new frontier of visual advertisements, and advertisers target directly these new standards of behavior. Advertising, there's all of these new inventions, and there begins to be pressure to keep up with the Joneses. So keeping up with the Joneses is kind of slang for, do you have what your neighbors have? Oh my gosh, the neighbors just got the new washing machine. Oh my gosh, the neighbors just got the new television station. I need to have what they have. And so there is this sense of competition that you have to have the latest and the best. And you feel like you've lost out and you feel left out if you don't have it. Ads also target teenagers. Remember, post-war years creates this in-between stage. Prior to this, it used to be you'd turn 17 or 18, you had a job, you got married, you were good to go for your life. But now there is this like age where you're not yet a kid and you're not still a kid, but you're not yet an adult. So advertisers begin to target teenagers with products especially designed for young people who then pressure their parents to buy the goods for them. So, another factor that creates this culture of conformity, believe it or not, is the creation of the interstate highway. When there is a system linking America of organized roads, franchises begin to develop along the highway, such as fast food restaurants, hotel motels. You can soon go to the same restaurant in multiple states. Think about it today. Where are your Cracker Barrel restaurants located? Typically, they're right off an interstate. Every Cracker Barrel pretty much has the same menu items. It's consistent. It is a culture of conformity. So no matter where you go, you can feel at home. Letter D, the very nature of the suburbs where you live. If you look at the picture directly below my face, you will see track housing that was built. Part of the GI Bill was giving home loans to veterans. However, there was one caveat in the GI Bill. It had to be new construction. So the very first little areas like this were built by a man called Levitt. Bill Levitt was his name. So these were called Levitt towns. And every single house pretty much looked the same. You could build a house in just a matter of days. And you had what your neighbors had. The houses were the same. 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, no basement because it takes longer to build a basement. And keep in mind, these neighborhoods were white. Racial covenants and redlining kept Black Americans from living in these neighborhoods. But that's a story for another lesson. Also, you start to see this nuclear family once again being the ideal. The GIs, upon returning, the expectation was that you build this house, you get married, and you have 2 kids, maybe 3 kids, but typically 2. And that becomes the American dream, so to speak. Although it's the white dream, this typical family really was not typical. Make sure you understand that the gender roles were very, very stereotyped in this ideal family. Dad worked, mom stayed home, made him the meatloaf, and would serve him a martini when he came home. We know that that's not really the case, but that's kind of what the expectation was. So corporate culture begins to demand conformity from its workers. The expectation for these returning GIs, of course, and that leads to the baby boom, but the expectation is that they get a job in an office setting, a white collar setting where they're a marketing man, an advertising man, or an accountant. It was considered more prestigious to have a white collar job rather than a blue collar where you're a mechanic and your hands are getting dirty or something like that. So the companies themselves demanded this conformity. You became a company man, and the term rat race was coined, where you wear the same suit. You could wear a blue suit or a gray suit. You had to wear a white shirt. You had to wear a hat, a fedora. Even how you looked created this culture of conformity. There was a book that was written that was later turned into a movie called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, which kind of is the epitome. But deep down inside, these men weren't really happy. And deep down inside, the women were not satisfied in doing the laundry and making meatloaf for their husbands. But that comes to play later. Let's move on. Challenges to conformity. Not everybody was living the Leave It to Beaver life, and not everybody was happy with the status quo. There were lots of challenges to conformity. This is actually going to be on the next 2 slides. Young people began to challenge authority. Imagine that. Teenagers, they wanted to challenge the ideas of their parents. It used to be they would go directly from childhood to adulthood. Now you have this prolonged adolescence, and older people were square. The young people were hip. They saw themselves as hip, and they began to express themselves through their clothing, through the music that they listened to, etc. Let's fast forward a little bit. In the 1960s, this splintering of cultures, of parents born pre-war and children born post-war, leads to the baby boom, of course, and this also leads to what is known as the generation gap. That, oh, mom and dad, you just don't get it. And at this point in time, there really was a big shift. Pre-war, you were 17 or 18, you got a job, you were done. Now you're 17 or 18, you still might be living at home, but yet you're an adult. You're not really sure of your role. Let's move on. Number 2, artists began to challenge. The first challenge that we see is in the era and the age of music. This is the great age of, you guessed it, rock and roll. Rock and roll was for the young people. It was the devil's music. And good, upstanding, middle-class white Americans didn't really want their children listening to it. Of course, children wanted to listen to it. Teenagers, it was fast-paced. You could dance to it. It was fun. Originally, this music was called race music because it was predominantly in the Black communities and it was played on Black radio stations. However, there was one man who bridged that gap. When you heard him on the radio, he sounded Black. But when you saw him in person, you saw that he was indeed a white man. His name was Elvis Presley. He began to bring rock and roll to the masses. Another young artist was Jerry Lee Lewis, who brings rock and roll to the masses. And they break these barriers, and soon young people are dancing and going to concerts, and there are fans, and there is music just for teenagers. Prior to this, there was no music just for teens. Imagine that, growing up on your parents' music. How horrible would that be? And moving on, within arts, still under the category of arts, there are graphic artists. So we are talking movies. One movie that portrayed teen angst, played by none other than the youngest and most tragic of the heartthrobs, James Dean. The picture is down here. He plays in a movie called Rebel Without a Cause. And it talks a little bit about juvenile delinquency and how hard it is to be a teenager. Artists such as Jackson Pollock break all barriers. This image up here of the splatter is Jackson Pollock. He breaks all of the traditional rules of art, and he does this abstract expressionism, expressing angst and expressing all of the emotion just with paint splatters. And last and certainly not least, another man who breaks barriers within graphic arts is Hugh Hefner. Hugh Hefner publishes Playboy magazine, and as you can see, that's the very first edition. Marilyn Monroe, super famous, was the Playboy centerfold. She was the first bunny. It breaks all of the rules. Playboy becomes a lifestyle guideline for single, unmarried men. Keep in mind, still traditionally white men, but it challenges the status quo. Intellectuals challenge the status quo, and intellectuals challenge authority. The very first movement of intellectuals predates the so-called hippies. This group is called the Beats. They are the beatniks. The Beats, they seek beatitude. They seek transcendence, right? They're like the transcendentalists of their era. They want to go beyond the experience that the regular world has to offer. They want to go deep into the mind and experience everything life has to offer. The most famous of the Beats is a man by the name of Jack Kerouac, and he writes a book called On the Road. He and his friends load up in an automobile in the 1940s, and they fuel up on all sorts of drugs, and they drive from coast to coast. And he writes about it. This is the original manuscript. It is written in a scroll. It is written in stream of consciousness. To me, this book is one of the most important books of the 20th century. And I don't know why you guys don't read it in your English classes, because it breaks barriers. It doesn't use traditional grammar. It is like an improv. It is like a saxophone playing just from the heart and soul, but it is the improvisation of words. And it is a little difficult to read at first, but it is quite brilliant. And to me, it completely revolutionizes literature forever. On the Road, check it out if you ever have to read it. Next is an intellectual in terms of the science field. Albert Kinsey is a biologist, and he begins to conduct extensive research into, are you ready for it? The sexual behaviors and sexual lives of men and women in the 1950s. Shocking to do a report about sex in the 1950s. They're shocking, his reports, because they expose that the cultural norm of chastity was not nearly as prevalent as people believed. So, yes, people were having sex. So, keep that in mind. He reported, Kinsey, in his reports, that people were having premarital sex. People, married people, were having adulterous relationships. And homosexuality was a thing. And this was not widely discussed. So at the time, it was shocking. So the Kinsey reports intellectuals challenging that homogeneous culture, that we're not all the same. And for the 1950s, it was shocking. And even to some people today, that still might be shocking. I would hope not. Last and certainly not least, we see the invisible man. I'm going to move my face over there. There I am. And Ralph Ellison is a Black American man, and he calls out white culture for ignoring African Americans in the United States. And the book is called The Invisible Man. He writes, I am an invisible man. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. So that's powerful. He cites in his book the fact that TV shows ignore Black Americans completely outside of being a domestic servant, like a maid, etc. Even in one of the most popular movies, and the first Black woman to win an Oscar was Mammy from Gone with the Wind. She was a Black servant. So keep that in mind. Ralph Ellison kind of blows the lid off of this cultural expectation of white perfectness and white privilege. So I know this was a long video, but that is it. Hopefully by now you are able to decide the creation of this mass culture and the challenges to it. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next lesson.